Dear moderator, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I am Noura Al-Habsi, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Trends Research and Advisory. Thank you for joining us, and I'm pleased to have you back with us for the first Trends Political Islam e-forum, Path to Caliphate, the truth behind Muslim Brotherhood project. Today, in the first symposium of this series, we are going to discuss Muslim Brotherhood's global journey, from mastery of the world to hunt for safe havens. From its early days, the Muslim Brotherhood has tried to be integrated in the fabric of other communities for enforcing its ideology and recruiting new affiliates. It also aimed at building relationships with social and political entities in the US and Europe. The experts we have gathered tonight will shed light on the evolution of a brotherhood global rule and the growing Western's concern about political Islam, as well as the future of international brotherhood organization. On behalf of Veterans Research and Advisory, I thank all the panelists, the moderator, and viewers worldwide who have joined us today to participate in this session. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I give the floor to our evening moderator, Dr. Victor Jarfas. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nora, for this introduction, and welcome everyone to this e-symposium. So I'm Dr. Victor Gervais, a researcher here at Trends Research and Advisory, and I would like to thank all of you for joining us this evening virtually. I'm delighted to moderate today's event and to be joined by such a highly distinguished group of experts who have kindly accepted our invitation to share their knowledge, their expertise on this very important topic. But just before we start, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping points. So first, each speaker will have about 15 minutes to present, and we have a total of 6 speakers today, so I would greatly appreciate if you could keep your presentations short and succinct to make sure that we have ample time at the end for Q&As. Second, for the benefit of all speakers, an interpretation function is available for this discussion. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see an interpretation tag. And you'll have the option to select either the Arabic or English language. And well, when you do so, make sure also to mute the original audio, right? And as for members of the audience who are joining us via YouTube or social media, you have the options of watching either the English or the Arabic version of this e-symposium. And finally, as I mentioned, there will be time for Q&A at the end. So if you are interested in sending us questions, you're of course most welcome and strongly encouraged to do so. And you can email them to us at the following email address. So it's events@trendsresearch.org. So I won't waste any more time as we have plenty to discuss today. And I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker for today. His name is Dr. Ashraf Al-Isawi. He's a researcher at Trends. And Dr. Isawi is an expert in the Gulf region affairs, and he specializes in security and strategic studies. Dr. Al-Isawi has published several books, most notably The American Policy in the Gulf Region After September 11 Attacks, a comparative study of the Gulf Wars. And his publications also include several publications in scientific peer-reviewed journal. So Dr. Ashraf, please, the floor is yours. And so I believe that Dr. Ashraf will speak in Arabic. So I think it's the right time to test this this interpretation function for all of us. Thank you very much. Dr. Ashraf, the floor is yours.
شكرا جزيلا. بداية أتوجه بالشكر العميق لمركز ترندز للبحوث والاستشارات لتنظيم هذه الندوة المهمة في موضوعها وتوقيتاتها معا في ظل تصاعد وتيرة الاهتمام في الآونة الأخيرة وخاصة على الساحة الأوروبية بالجماعات الإسلاموية التي تتبنى أيديولوجية معادية لقيم التعايش والتسامح والحرية في هذه الدول. إن موضوع ندوة اليوم والذي يحمل عنوان رحلة الإخوان المسلمين العالمية من أستاذية العالم إلى البحث عن ملاذات آمنة يواكب حالة الجدل المثارة حاليا أوروبيا ودوليا وعربيا حول خطورة المرتكزات الفكرية والأيديولوجية لجماعة الإخوان المسلمين وحركات الإسلام السياسي التي تدور في فلكها بوجه عام. وقبل الحديث عن المحور المفصل في هذه الندوة المهمة والذي يتناول طبيعة العلاقة بين الأطر التنظيمية والفكرية لجماعة الإخوان المسلمين، أود التركيز أو التأكيد على 3 نقاط رئيسية ربما توضح طبيعة العلاقة بين الجانب التنظيمي والجانب الفكري لجماعة الإخوان المسلمين. النقطة الأولى أن جماعة الإخوان المسلمين أو رحلة جماعة الإخوان المسلمين العالمية اعتمدت بالأساس على التنظيم الدولي للجماعة. هذا التنظيم الذي يمثل بالنسبة للجماعة الزراعة الخارجية والأداة الدبلوماسية في الترويج لأفكار الجماعة في الخارج والدفاع عنها في مواجهة أي ضغوط تتعرض لها. كما أن هذا التنظيم يعني يحاول أن يقدم الجماعة في الغرب بصورة الجماعة المعتدلة التي تؤمن بقيم الاعتدال والتعايش والتسامح والديمقراطية. النقطة الأخرى أن جماعة الإخوان المسلمين أو بالأحرى التنظيم الدولي للجماعة يعد نموذجا للفاعلين الدوليين من غير الدول. فهذا التنظيم يتواجد في حوالي أو في أكثر من 70 دولة في العالم، كما يمتلك هذا التنظيم العديد من أدوات التأثير في التطورات الإقليمية والدولية. في الوقت ذاته فإن هذا التنظيم لا يسعى فقط إلى تمكين جماعة الإخوان المسلمين من السلطة في الدول العربية كما حدث إذا تجربة ما يسمى أحداث الربيع العربي، وإنما يسعى أيضا إلى بناء دولة عابرة القارات في العديد من دول العالم. النقطة الثالثة التي أود التأكيد عليها تتعلق بالأيديولوجية أو الأفكار التي تتبناها جماعة الإخوان المسلمين، وهي أيديولوجيا إنجاز القول هي أيديولوجيا عابرة الحدود لا تحترم السيادة الوطنية للدول، وإنما الأخطر أنها لا تقر بخصوصية هذه الدول الثقافية والحضارية والاجتماعية. وهذا ربما يفسر تنامي حالة القلق من هذه الأيديولوجيا في العديد من الدول الأوروبية في الآونة الأخيرة. أنتقل إلى ذلك بعد ذلك إلى النقطة الرئيسية وأحاول فيها أتتبع رحلة جماعة الإخوان المسلمين نحو العالمية. رحلة جماعة الإخوان المسلمين نحو العالمية خلافا لما كان يتصور البعض هي رحلة بدأت مبكرا منذ السنوات الأولى لنشأة جماعة الإخوان المسلمين، حينما قام مؤسس الجماعة بتأسيس قسم العالم الإسلامي ضمن الهيكل التنظيمي والإداري لجماعة الإخوان المسلمين. وكان الهدف الرئيسي لهذا القسم هو التواصل مع الشخصيات والقيادات الدينية في العالم الإسلامي للترويج لفكر جماعة الإخوان المسلمين وإنشاء فروع الجماعة في الدول العديد من الدول الإسلامية. وبالفعل استطاع هذا القسم ضمن الهيكل التنظيمي للجماعة أن يؤسس وحدات أو فروع للجماعة في العديد من الدول الإسلامية في ثلاثينات القرن الماضي كالسنغال وأفغانستان وغيرها من الدول. ثم بعد ذلك تطورت الأطر التنظيمية التي تساعد جماعة الإخوان المسلمين على تنفيذ رحلتها العالمية. ففي الخمسينيات والستينات من القرن الماضي قامت الجماعة بتأسيس هيكل دولي آخر أطلقت عليه المكتب التنفيذي. هذا المكتب التنفيذي يعني يتميز عن قسم العالم الإسلامي بأنه يركز هذه المرة على تغلغل جماعة الإخوان المسلمين في الدول الأوروبية، ويستغل تواجد قيادات جماعة الإخوان المسلمين التي فرقوا مصر أثناء الصدام مع نظام الرئيس الراحل جمال عبد الناصر كالقيادات من نوعية سعيد رمضان ويوسف ندى في تأسيس وجود فعلي للجماعة في الدول الأوروبية وخاصة في ألمانيا وفرنسا وسويسرا. التطور الأبرز في رحلة جماعة الإخوان المسلمين العالمية كان في تأسيس التنظيم الدولي للجماعة في العام 1982. هذا التطور أتاح للجماعة ترجمة أهدافها العالمية على أرض الواقع، ونجح هذا التنظيم في تعزيز تواجد الجماعة في العديد من الدول الأوروبية وفي الولايات المتحدة وفي أمريكا الشمالية وفي أمريكا اللاتينية. إذا كما هو واضح أن رحلة جماعة الإخوان المسلمين بدأت منذ البداية بالتركيز على الدول الإسلامية، ثم انتقلت بعد ذلك إلى إطار أوسع الدول الأوروبية والأمريكية، ثم انتقلت في مرحلتها الثالثة نحو إطار عام يشمل قارات العالم بأكملها في محاولة للتبرير بالفكر وأيديولوجية جماعة الإخوان المسلمين العالمية. هذه الأطر التنظيمية لجماعة الإخوان المسلمين التي كانت تحمل الترويج لأفكارها العالمية كانت في حاجة إلى إصباغها بطابع أيديولوجي حتى يعني تقتنع الدول التي تسعى هذه التنظيمات للترويج في فكر جماعة الإخوان المسلمين. وبالتالي جماعة الإخوان المسلمين أكدت على عدة مبادئ أيديولوجية وأفكار أيديولوجية كان أبرزها يعني عالمية الدعوة الإخوانية. جماعة الإخوان المسلمين كما نعرف جميعا منذ نشأتها الأولى تنظر إلى نفسها باعتبارها جماعة عالمية وليست محلية، وهذا ما أكده حسن بنا في العديد من رسائله وكتبه المختلفة. المبدأ الأيديولوجي الآخر اللي يتعلق الذي تروج له جماعة الإخوان المسلمين هو أستاذية العالم. يعني جماعة الإخوان المسلمين تنظر باستعلاء أو تنظر إلى أنها الجماعة التي تخول لها الحديث باسم الدين الإسلامي والدفاع عنه. ولهذا فإن جماعة الإخوان المسلمين يمكن القول أن تأسيس التنظيم الدولي لجماعة الإخوان المسلمين جاء ترجمة أو تجسيد واضح لفكرة أستاذية العالم التي تسعى من خلالها جماعة الإخوان المسلمين ليست فقط التنظيم بين فروع الجماعة والجماعة الأم في مصر، ولكن قيادة التنظيمات الإسلامية بمختلف توجهاتها سواء كانت دينية أو دعوية في العديد من الدول العالم. المبدا الثالث لا ينفصل، المبدا الايديولوجي الثالث لا ينفصل عن المبدئين السابقين، وهو موقف جماعه الاخوان المسلمين من الدوله الوطنيه بمفهومها المعاصر. فكما هو معروف فان جماعه الاخوان المسلمين لا تعترف بالدوله الوطنيه بمفهومها المعاصر، بل انها تنظر اليها باعتبارها العائق الرئيسي امام تحقيق اهدافها العالميه. كما تنظر الى الدوله الوطنيه باعتبارها يعني حدود مجتمع يجب ازالتها. المبدا الرابع الايديولوجي الرابع الذي كانت عليه جماعه الاخوان المسلمين هو احياء دوله الخلافه الاسلاميه. من الطبيعي ان جماعه تنظر الى نفسها باعتبارها جماعه عالميه وجماعه تسعى لتحقيق استاديه العالم، وجماعه لا تؤمن بالحدود ولا تعترف بالسياده الوطنيه للدول، تسعى الى احياء فكره الخلافه الاسلاميه وانشاء دوله عابره للقارات في جميع دول العالم. هذه المبادئ والافكار يعني لم تكن فقط مجرد اطار ايديولوجي او فكري تعبر عنه الجماعه في ادبياتها الفكريه او وسائل الاعلام المختلفه، ولكن الخطير في الامر ان هذه الافكار تم ترجمتها الى استراتيجيات عمل واضحه وخطط مدروسه لترجمتها على ارض الواقع. واركز هنا على وثيقتين مهمتين توضحان كيف ان جماعه الاخوان المسلمين تنتقل من الاطار الفكري والايديولوجي الى ارض الواقع. الوثيقه الاولى تحمل عنوان مذكره تفسيريه الهدف الاستراتيجي العام لجماعه في امريكا الشماليه. هذه الوثيقه اعدها احد قيادات الاخوان ويدعى محمد اكرم عام 1991. وهذه الوثيقه تسعى الى نشر مبادئ الاسلام في امريكا الشماليه والترويج لفكر الجماعه العالمي. في الوقت ذاته فان هذه الوثيقه تتضمن 29 منظمه تتراوح بين مراكز اعلاميه وثقافيه واعلاميه تؤيد الجماعه وتروج لافكارها. من ضمن هذه المؤسسات مثلا على سبيل المثال الجمعيه الاسلاميه لامريكا الشماليه والمعهد العالمي للفكر الاسلامي ومنظمه كير وغيرها العديد من المعاهد والمؤسسات والمراكز التي تعمل بكامل حريتها دون اي رقابه على انشطتها. واتصور ان هذه المنظمه الوثيقه الاخوانيه التي تؤسس لكيفيه اختراق جماعه الاخوان المسلمين في امريكا الشماليه في حاجه الى المزيد من تسليط الضوء عليها، لانها ترتبط بالازمه الراهنه التي تثار حول خطوره ايديولوجيه جماعه الاخوان المسلمين. الوثيقه الثانيه ايضا التي تكشف مخططات جماعه الاخوان المسلمين العالميه هي وثيقه تحمل عنوان المشروع الكبير. هي وثيقه سريه عثرت عليها الشرطه السويسريه بعد احداث 11 سبتمبر في فيلا رجل الاعمال الاخواني يوسف ندى، وهذه الوثيقه لا تختلف اطلاقا عن الوثيقه السابقه. كل الاختلاف ان هذه الوثيقه تركز على كيفيه تغلغل جماعه الاخوان المسلمين في الدول الاوروبيه من خلال اتباع العديد من الادوات الثقافيه والاعلاميه والثقافيه. إذا واضح أن هناك يعني ترابط بين هاتين الوثيقتين ولا يمكن الفصل بينهما، فكلهما يجسد موضوع فكرة البعد العالمي لجماعة الإخوان المسلمين، وكلهما يعتمد على فكرة التغلغل الناعم في المجتمعات الأوروبية والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وكلهما يسعى إلى بناء مجتمعات موازية في هذه الدول تمهيدا لتقبل هذه الدول في مرحلة لاحقة لفكرة الخلافة الإسلامية. ما تشترك فيه هاتين الوثيقتين أنهما توضحان بطبيعة بكل وضوح أدوات التحرك الإخواني للتغلغل في المجتمعات الغربية، وهذه الأدوات يعني يمكن الإشارة إليها في عدة نقاط. أول هذه الأدوات تأسيس مجتمعات مغلقة في هذه الدول تقتصر على الجاليات الإسلامية، بحيث أن جماعة الإخوان المسلمين تسيطر على هذه الجماعات وتحددها وتحدد طبيعة توجهاتها. الأداة الثانية السيطرة على العديد من المراكز الثقافية والجمعيات الخيرية في الدول الغربية التي تتبنى أيديولوجية الجماعة وتعمل على خدمة أهدافها. الآلية الثالثة التي تعتمد عليها جماعة الإخوان المسلمين هي توظيف الأذرع الإعلامية المختلفة في رسم صورة مثالية لجماعة الإخوان المسلمين وتصويرها في الغرب باعتبارها جماعة تؤمن بقيم الديمقراطية والانفتاح. واللافت في هذا الصدد أن موقع جماعة الإخوان المسلمين باللغة الإنجليزية الموجه للغرب يتحدث باستمرار عن الديمقراطية واحترام حقوق الإنسان، ويسوق للجماعة لأنها متماثلة مع منظومة القيم الغربية، في حين موقع الجماعة باللغة العربية حينما يتحدث إلى الشعوب العربية فإنه ينطوي على التحريض على العنف وتغذية خطاب الكراهية. من الواضح في ضوء ما سبق أن التنظيم الدولي للإخوان المسلمين يسعى إلى اختراق المؤسسات الثقافية والإعلامية والتعليمية في العديد من الدول الغربية، لأنها المسؤولة عن تشكيل الوعي وقيادة التأثير في هذه الدول، وهذه نقطة جوهرية ينبغي الالتفات إليها جيدا. وربما هذا ما أدركته دولة أو حكومة النمسا مؤخرا حينما بدأت تركز على الأفكار في حربها ضد جماعات الإسلام السياسي التي تسعى إلى إيجاد مجتمعات موازية في هذه الدول. الأداة الرابعة التي تعتمد عليها جماعة الإخوان المسلمين هي تعزيز التواصل مع القوى الدولية الفاعلة وخاصة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. وكما هو معروف فإن الكتاب الأخير الرئيس الامريكي السابق باراك اوباما كشف عن العديد من الحقائق التي تبرز ان هناك اتصالات كانت بين الولايات المتحده وجماعه الاخوان المسلمين ابان احداث الربيع العربي. هذه الحقائق والمعطيات التي كشفتها هذه الوثائق الاخوانيه تفسر لنا بوضوح حاله القلق التي تشهدها العديد من الدول الاوروبيه في الاونه الاخيره، التي تعبر عن نفسها والتي بدات تعبر عن نفسها في تحذيرات عديدة أطلقتها أوساط سياسية وأمنية واستخباراتية أوروبية تحذر من خطورة الأيديولوجيا التي تتبناها جماعة الإخوان المسلمين والحركات الإسلاموية بوجه عام. وأذكر هنا بعض هذه التحذيرات. في العام 2014 حذرت أصوات في البرلمان البريطاني من وجود علاقة بين أيديولوجيا جماعة الإخوان المسلمين والفكر المتطرف. في العام الماضي حذر أو وصف تقرير سويسري أدبيات جماعة الإخوان المسلمين بأنها أدبيات غير متسامحة وتروج للفكر المتطرف. في العام الماضي أيضا حذر تقرير صادر عن هيئة حماية الدستور الألمانية من محاولات جماعة الإخوان المسلمين أخوانة المجتمع الألماني وتغيير نمط التعليم وبناء مجتمعات متوازية تعبر عن فكر جماعة الإخوان المسلمين. أيضا في شهر يونيو من العام الجاري حذر تقرير صادر عن مجلس الشيوخ الفرنسي من محاولات الجماعات الإسلامية نشر الفكر المتطرف وإقامة مناطق منفصلة لهذه الجماعات. كل هذه التحذيرات الصادرة عن أجهزة أمنية واستخباراتية وسياسية في الدول الأوروبية تكشف بوضوح حجم المخاوف المتنامية في هذه الدول من الأيديولوجية التي تتبناها جماعة الإخوان المسلمين وتسعى إلى فرضها على مجتمعاتها غير عباءة بخصوصية هذه الدول الثقافية والحضارية والمجتمعية. وختاما أود أن أنهي حديثي بالتأكيد على أمرين مهمين. الأول أن الإجراءات التي اتخذتها بعض الدول الأوروبية في الآونة الأخيرة لاحتواء خطر جماعات الإخوان المسلمين وحركات الإسلام السياسي تندرج ضمن حقها السيادي في اتخاذ الخطوات التي تضمن لها الحفاظ على هويتها الوطنية من محاولات أي اختراق لأمنها الشامل بمفهوم الثقافي والاجتماعي والسياسي. الأمر الثاني الذي أنهي به حديثي أن أي تحرك لمواجهة خطر جماعة الإخوان المسلمين وحركات الإسلام السياسي بوجه عام ينبغي أن يأخذ في الاعتبار أن هذه الجماعات لا تعبر بأي حال عن الأحوال عن الدين الإسلامي الحنيف ومبادئه السمحاء التي تدعو إلى التسامح والتعايش وقبول الآخر، وأن أي خلط بين حركات الإسلام السياسي وبين الإسلام كدين يقدم فرصة لقوى التطرف والإرهاب التي تستغل ذلك في إزكاء الصدام بين الأديان والحضارات والترويج لخطاب الكراهية والعنف. وشكرا جزيلا على حسن استماعكم. شكرا جزيلا.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ashraf, for those very insightful comments and very rich presentation. So moving on directly to our second speaker, we are very pleased today to be joined by Dr. Cesari, who is the president of the European Academy of Religion and professor of religion and politics at the University of Birmingham. Her most recent publications include a book entitled What is Political Islam, which was published in 2018, as well as a co-authored book titled Islam, Gender, and Democracy, published with Oxford University Press. So please, Dr. Cesari, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation and for this lively conversation I hope we'll have with also my colleagues and co-panelists. Before I start, I would like to share with you my screen with PowerPoint. Can you see that now?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Okay. So I call this the riddle of political Islam because I would like to posit my remarks about the Muslim Brotherhood in a broader landscape of political Islam, because usually the two are considered as synonymous, while historically and politically there are some differences that I would like to emphasize. But to start with a sort of assessment, at least since the Islamic revolution in Iran, there have been what I call a roller coaster of evaluation of the relevance, political relevance of Islamism and its longevity. And so sometimes it's seen as a strong political force. And I would say that since the failed Arab Spring and the rise of Daesh, it has been evaluated as a failure or something that is not working anymore. And I would like to take a distance vis-à-vis this position and look at the Muslim Brotherhood beyond the Islamic parties and beyond what I would call institutional politics. And so for that, we have to look at the Muslim Brotherhood beyond political ideology and partisan division. And that brings us another approach to religion and politics that is unfamiliar because we have been raised, myself as a political scientist of the West, with the idea that the religious secular divide is inherent. It is not inherent to any religion. And especially in monotheism, if we do some comparative work, we can see that all, not only Islam, all revelation-based communities consider the duty of the believers and members of this community, not only to God, but also to society. And it will be the specific history of the West, European, Western European countries to create this divide between what is religion and what is politics after the war of religion. I don't have time to enter in that, but that's a given. And based on this given, we see emerging the nation as the modern political community. And why is it modern? Because it's based on two principles that you cannot find in any pre-modern community, which is equality of individuals and popular sovereignty. It doesn't mean automatically that this translates into democracy. Actually, even in Europe, it will take a couple of centuries before having, you know, from nation to democracy, an evolution. But it happens that for the Muslim countries that emerged on the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the post-colonial or modern nation state will be built on these two principles. And again, we do not pay attention here enough to the fact that the state in these countries come before the nation. There is no Turkish nation until Atatürk. There is no Pakistan until Dr. Jinnah. So unlike the history in the West, where you have a sort of continuous interaction between proto-nation and proto-state, what you see emerging on the collapse of the caliphate is a very authoritarian and secular process of creating nations. And this is the premise on which we can look at the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam in general. Because what does this mean? It means that the state, and that's a point I am making again and again since this book that you kindly mentioned in 2008, the first builder of political Islam is the secular national state. Why? Because it did something that was unprecedented in the caliphate, historical caliphate. It nationalized all the endowments. They became state property, while before that they were independent of the power, and there was no central power or bureaucracy that was covering all these aspects of life across the huge Ottoman Empire. So nationalization of the endowments, nationalization of the mosques and their maintenance and management, putting the clerics on the payroll, which also didn't happen before, and ignoring the diversity of religion, including among Islam. You know, you see emerging everywhere sort of cooperation, I would say cooptation, between a certain trend of Islam or madhab or school and the state administration, and hence neglecting or completely omitting the diversity, because people tend to forget that the Muslim empire were multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, and multicultural. And this is gone. That's what political scientists call indeed the nationalization process, is that an homogenization process. What I show in my work is that this is the central or foundational point on which the state will take on a prerogative that it didn't have before, which is you belong to the new nation and you are a Muslim. Think of Kemal Atatürk. Indeed, he removed Islam from all the social life and public space. And at the same time, he created a representative body of Islam based on the Hanafi school and paid the cleric and changed their training to adjust to the state needs. But we still call it secular state. That's why for me, that's a big, a big puzzlement right there. So what do Turks grew up with you are Turkish and you are Muslim. So that's why even under the Kemalists, the Alevi, the Christians, other minority had issues. Okay. So why is it important? Because you see emerging there and a perception of Islam, again, that is modern, that is not traditional or authentic Islam, that the expectation of citizens vis-à-vis Islam are seen as a public norm, granted and regulated by the state. That's what the foundation of political Islam, the state-centered approach to the management of the community, while in the Muslim Empire, the clerics were autonomous in managing locally the different communities. And these norms outline the moral standards for society. And this again predates Islamism or Islamic political party. I give you here some data that show how much people, even if they are not Islamist, even if they would call themselves secular, would still consider that Sharia should be the official law. So this vision of Sharia as state law is modern, and it has been built in by these new national communities. I don't have time to go through all the results here, but you can see that people are pretty comfortable by the state-centered approach to Islam that should regulate the public space. And again, this is cuts across between what we wrongly call in the West, the so-called secular, versus the Islamist. because again, the secular in Muslim countries do not reject this kind of conflation between state law, state institution, and Islam. What they reject is the role of Islam independently of the state by Muslim group. And that's what the Muslim Brothers bring in. Based on this political culture, the Muslim Brothers I'm trying to move my slide. Okay. Bear with me here. Yeah, so political Islam first is seen as a way by the state to shape the citizenry. Islam has been tremendous resources in the hand of the secular nationalist rulers to build the nation. So in itself, it doesn't make it incompatible with democracy. So this is what I call the first wave of political Islam. Then you see emerging the second wave, which is religiously based opposition to the state, because the state is seen indeed not democratic enough, not just enough, not Islamic enough in order to improve the development of the society. And again, it means that an Islamic state is a consequence as a demand of this preliminary politicization of Islam by the nation state. There is nothing in the tradition about the state being, an Islamic state being the end goal of the revelation-based community. So where the strength of the Muslim Brothers appears is not so much in the Islamic party investment or involvement. And here we'll also bring another dimension. The strength of the Muslim Brotherhood is in its feature as a social movement, focused not on taking on the state, but on changing society. The foundational message of Hassan al-Banna is changing one Muslim at a time. It is not status-centered. He made it clear in a lot of his position. That's why the Muslim Brothers have been the strongest when they work closely to different segments of the Muslim societies to provide different kinds of services. You don't need to have a card of a political party to be part of this fabric of Muslim society on a daily basis. And you have tons of surveys that show that this is what attracts most of Muslim citizens to this kind of group. So here you can see a difference between the Muslim Brothers in initial vision and other Islamist group like the Jamaat Islamiyah in Pakistan by founded by Maududi, because Maududi explicitly targeted the state, not the initial phase of the Muslim Brothers. And this has been its strength everywhere. The moment the Muslim Brothers channel its energy into political party and become partisan and not representative of the whole society, it loses some credibility. So you can see this emerging everywhere, from Morocco to Tunisia. You also see it with the sad or ill evolution of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt after the 2001 revolution. At the moment of the revolution, there is a fantastic, fascinating discussion emerging in the Muslim Brothers with young people saying we should not put all our energy into the building of a party. And the older generation, which understandably was, tortured, persecuted, put in jail by the authoritarian state, and saying, no, we need now to show that we exist politically. And the tension was there, and we saw what happened to the attempt to be part of the institutional politics. I'm not saying that the reason of the failure is the Muslim Brothers in itself. It is also the fact that the military never given up on the power. It's called Praetorian regime. It was at the end still the main instrument of power. But even though I think the Muslim Brothers from within didn't take enough into account this position of arbiter or referee above all the partisan distinction. And you can make the same assessment with the evolution of Erdogan in Turkey and its involvement and even its leadership and skills in managing the state institutions. So what is happening here is a sort of disconnect between the reality of politics, in which movements like the Muslim Brothers have to evolve or navigate, and that are by definition not democratic. I'm always puzzled, why are we putting the question of democracy only on the Muslim Brothers, while the environment in which they evolve is by definition not democratic? Actually, if you can see, before it turned authoritarian in Turkey, if you can see the first phase of the AKP party in ruling, they brought more democratization to institutions than the Kemalists did. So again, the question of democracy, I think, is ill-fated here and doesn't reflect the reality of the distribution of power on the ground. So as much as we have to take into account these different layers of political Islam, I think also we have to take into account what level, what domain of democracy are really clashing with different expression of political Islam. So again, if I recapitulate, political Islam is not only Islamic parties, social movement, but also state institutions and policies that shape the demand of the later Islamic parties and social movements. The demand, the mobilization are not the same because they do not evolve in the same institutional and political environment. If we turn to democracy, today, most of analysts would tell you that there is no more a strict division between democratic and undemocratic. What you have seen emerge is what some of my colleagues call hybrid democracy, meaning it is not enough to judge by free and fair election. After all, you can say that in some of the countries that have gone through what's called the third wave of democratization, including Eastern Europe, you can see that elections happen. It doesn't mean that the other domain of democracy that I am listing here, separation of powers, rule of law, civil liberty, are really all respected. You can even argue that in some European countries, civil liberties are eroded right now in the name of security. So if we break down these different levels of democracy, we can then evaluate which level is problematic for Islamist movement, including the Muslim Brothers. And what, if I go back here, you would agree with, I'm not talking about Daesh or global radical groups. I'm talking about, again, about Islamist movements like the Brotherhood that have been central in the fabric of Muslim societies in the last 50 years, and that can translate sometimes in political parties and remain fairly national. They do not have, most of them, any issue with election. They do not have issue with separation of power. They do not have issues with the rule of law and independence of the judiciary. What they want, and that's where the clashes happen with the so-called secular state, is they want an extension of Islamic prescription within the secular law, knowing that already in the secular states, except Turkey, civil law is already shaped by Islamic prescription. Most of the secular state created civil law, family code based on the Islamic prescription. So they are not contesting that. What they want is more legislation influenced by Islam. And again, according to the country and the political environment, these demands differ. Sometimes it can be looking for the restitution of hudud or Islamic punishment or criminal law, which is a tiny, tiny minority. Sometimes it's more about infusing or including into the civil law some moral principles. I remember a fantastic discussion on Islamic bonds, for example, in Egypt. Where the clash that is really happening is on civil liberty. And what does this mean? Here I make a difference between what I call individual rights and rights of the self. And these are not the same. Again, if we look at individual rights, most of the Islamist movement have no issue with equality in education, equality in political life, and equality in social activities, including for women. Okay, I mean, we have to be clear here. I remember again, after 2001, Al-Azhar issuing a Bill of Rights of Women, reminding people that Islam doesn't prevent women to be educated, to have a social life, or to get into politics. But, and that's where the shoe pinches, so to speak, the question of the self, and that's a different right. It's about the body, the sexuality, the reproduction. These, for most of members of this kind of Islamist group, are still to be regulated by Islamic prescription. And again, this is not specific to Islam. In America, you see the same kinds of demand emerging from other Christian conservative groups. And that's why you can see the tension here between the national secular community and the religiously based community, where the self is not completely free. It is still bounded to the prescription of the revelation-based community. And that's where the tensions may arise. So it is not so much that the Muslim Brothers are an impediment to modernity. Actually, they are the outcome of modernity. In most of countries, they have evolved and facilitated the modernization of the country. But there are still this tension about you are not completely free as a person outside the boundaries of the religious community, which is very difficult to understand in the West, where the religion and the behaving as a person have been pretty much disconnected. So if I had to wrap up here, I would say that history shows that the future of the Muslim Brotherhood is not so much in a state-centered approach to win election, to get into power. It is much more about maintaining this significance as a social movement across different segments of Muslim society. And it's interesting because the Hennada party, since the Jasmine Revolution and the thinking of Rashid Ghanouchi, has really evolved toward that. And you can see that there is now this kind of thinking toward a more social-centered rather than state-centered approach to politics that would reinstall or reinstate the legitimacy of the Brothers as a social movement, not that he has lost it, but that the entanglement with institutional politics had made it more challenging and have also given lots of leverage to the state to oppress or try to control this kind of political Islam. So I will close here in saying that the future of the Muslim Brothers is as a social movement more than a political party. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cesari, for this, I mean, very interesting and stimulating presentation. You made a number of key points. I will just note for now the importance of the state development process in the region, and the importance it had in shaping the development of political Islam, which I think is very important point to make. So thank you very much for this presentation indeed. And so now I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Mr. Amjad Taha. who's a British Arab journalist and political analyst, and among other things, the author of the book entitled "The Deception of the Arab Spring." So, Dr. Taha, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. So, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. To make it even easier and brief for everyone here, I mean, the evolution of brotherhoods in terms of global role from supports to mobilization. Let's make it very simple. PLLF strategy, that's what they use, which is the play slow and lose fast. So far, it's been working. That's the only strategy they've been putting forward so far. I won't go into the history side of the, as you're all well informed about it. I myself see no difference at all between the Nazis' attitude in reaching power and the Muslim Brotherhood itself. I think both are use fundamentalism and radicalization to reach power. As they seize power, they eradicate any society that opposes them. We've seen how Morsi, when he came in power in Egypt, he didn't give any other society or communities or parties any chance. We've seen how Erdogan is behaving with all the opposition, anyone who opposes him, and he is somehow associated with the Muslim Brotherhoods and so on. So not very, we don't have that much good of example for Muslim Brotherhoods behaving otherwise. The support that Muslim Brotherhood had in Spain, France, Germany, Netherlands, Great Britain, Scandinavians made it even, they made them even unstoppable in somehow. And with for example, we're talking about 500 organizations in the European, and the capital of and their capital reaches about $3.7 billion. They are still making a great mobilization. And now how they do that is they have this kind of strategy that the Brotherhood has adopted to become, as doctor from Birmingham University has confirmed, they become integrated into European society. But however, now recently they support themselves. So they don't rely on a lot of institutions from our side. They still do, but if we give an example of how they support themselves, they have, for example, 43,000 supermarkets in the EU, 11,000 of those are in UK, 8,000 of those are in Sheffield, London, and Birmingham. Islamic shopping, they rely on that in Europe. They have 928 of those. In UK, I'm going to name some of the charity organizations who are associated with the Muslim Brotherhoods. Now we're talking about Abrar, Al-Birara Foundation, Al-Khair Foundation, Al-Mizan Charitable Trust, Humanitarian Fund, Islamic Hub, Islamic Relief, Islamic Society, Islamic Text Society, Mercy Mission, Muslim Aid, Muslim Charity for Muslim Charity, Muslim Hands, Muslim Youth Helpline. All those are associated with Muslim Brotherhoods, and their money somehow goes through the Muslim Brotherhood and assists, help, and funds them. Islamic Relief itself, which is the fundamental economic basement for Muslim Brotherhood, has become an international agency that uses humanitarian cases to develop and open a business for members of Muslim Brotherhood in over 40 countries. I have visited their international headquarters in Birmingham, Islamic Relief Worldwide. It's well known. They have a lot of national office and affiliates, partners, registered branches spanning around like 50 countries. And their income in 2000, at least in 18, was about 128 million. They had a case investigation. I have attended that in the court, and they basically, let me tell you, this is a really important case that hasn't been on the media, unfortunately. That these guys, they were collecting money from the Brits to send it to Gaza, and guess what? That money was actually where it went to fund Morsi presidential election in Egypt. I have been a witness in those courts, and I have heard from their own even work affiliates who worked with them. And it's been a big case to the point that they had to change some of their managers and so on. Now the MBs, the Muslim Brotherhood, mobilize and advertise and recruit recently through the digital world, and this is really important right now. So they developed from going and through the normal societies and using mosque and so on to the digital mobilization. Even some of the mosque right now, they put their lectures online and they even go on the digital world. Now, how they use that? They're using, for example, we did a research about it, and a lot of data showed that 23,000 Twitter accounts are run from Qatar and Turkey and the East Libya and Gaza by the Muslim Brotherhoods, with 1.8 million tweets per month. We're talking about 500,000 of Facebook accounts, 780,000 Instagram account, 7,326,000. We're talking about Snapchat's accounts. We're talking about 3,648 web pages. That all those platforms and network, they do one thing: advertise Muslim Brotherhoods, and obviously throughout different languages. Now, the emergence and the growth of the Muslim Brotherhoods in Egypt from the 1930s to throughout the 1950s, we can outline it and evaluate it based on the possible explanation, which for the organization growth based on two things: the theories of political Islam and the concept of political opportunity structure in a social movement theory. Which right now we're not going to go through it because we don't have that much time. And there is a lot of research on that. I went through a lot of data from the organizational documents and classified US State Department files that shows and that explains this approach, and that and it also shows that the successful mobilization of the Muslim Brotherhoods was possible because of the way in which Islamic message was tied to organizational structure, activities, and strategies, and the everyday lives of Egyptian and other communities around the world. And when we're talking about around the world now, we have offices for them. They run Austria, Belgium, Canada, Germany, Italy, South Africa, Russia, Pakistan, Norway, Netherlands, Turkey, call it whichever, all these countries now, they're expanding. It's also, all this explains to us the understanding of how organization can arise in a highly neglected environment. Now, this was very important, and the how, where, and why, this kind of question, it was raised in UK, especially in March 2014, where we participated and looked into the case of British Prime Minister David Cameron office, as he asked the great friend of us, British ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Sir John Jengis, who led a government review into a Muslim Brotherhood. The investigation took part in of a review, which was completed in July 2014, I believe. The government also asked the interest party to submit evidence to be used in the review, and we did so. A lot of leaders participated in this. We're talking here about the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood's leader, Ibrahim Munir, Secretary General Mohammed Hussein, and as well as the leaders of the Tunisian party and Nahda, Rashid al-Ghannouchi, who all gave their kind of expert evidence, as well as the former general of Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, and also the leading figure of Moroccan Islamist Justice and Development Party were all interviewed by the Commission. In mid-September 2014, the report was handed over to the Prime Minister office, even though at that moment, the report literally clarified and said, if you are a Muslim Brotherhood member, or you become a member, you can become radical, and a person who can become radical can commit a crime and can become a terrorist. And literally in that report, I remember as we were reviewing it, Hassan al-Banna, he says, literally, I'm quoting here, Hassan al-Banna is a founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, accepted the political utility of violence, and the Brotherhood conducted attacks, including political assassination and attempt assassinating against Egyptian state targets and both British and Jewish interests during his lifetime. They literally had a problem with the Jew people. They were targeting them. They wanted to eradicate anything. They do not believe in any somehow a peace agreement with Israel whatsoever, under no circumstances. The Muslim Brotherhood, again, in that report says that at all levels have repeatedly, and this is really important, and here I might put this comment for our doctor from Birmingham University to comment on that, that the Muslim Brotherhood, if they're going to become part of the social society, explain how they're going to still up to this point at all levels have repeatedly defended Hamas against Israel. How is that explainable? How can you, from this moment, move to a social and become a very peaceful part of the society? This is really important because they include the use of suicide bombers and the killing of civilians. The Muslim Brotherhood affiliates itself with Hamas. The leadership of Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is Jordanian counterpart, and the Hamas are closely connected. They're all connected to each other. There are wider link with the Muslim Brotherhoods affiliated throughout the region. Senior members of the Muslim Brotherhoods routinely use officious and anti-Semitic language. Senior Muslim Brotherhoods figures and the associates, all that associates with them, have justified attacks against the coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a lot of reports on that. You can go back to the FBI and CIA and also the MI6 papers and resources. It gives you all that data and it's available. Leaders in the Muslim Brotherhoods have claimed this report has went to the parliament in UK, and I was one of the people who reviewed it and one of the people who participated in this, and he says leaders in the Muslim Brotherhood have claimed that the attack on 9/11 were fabricated by US. I don't know how these people can become part of the society if they still believe in that, and that the so-called war on terrorism, according to them, is an excuse attack on Muslims. The Muslim Brotherhoods have shaped the new Islamic societies of Britain. ISP we're talking about dominated the Muslim Association of Britain, MBA, and played an important role in establishing and running the Muslim Council of the Britain, that's MCB, it's known as MCB, and as you know, the MAB, which is the Muslim Association of Britain, became politically active. I think people from Britain can confirm that to me, and notably in connection with Palestine and Iraq, all the protests around those lines, and promoted candidate. I cannot name that, name them right now because of a regulation and rules, and promoted candidate in national and local election. The MSP obtained a dialogue with the government under that role, and they created basically a lobby. They have MPs they support, and he or she, the MP, will mobilize their event and support them somehow. In a mid-2014, the Muslim Brotherhood in UK compromised a range of organizations loosely associated together, but without a common command or control, or not even a single leader. That was one of the things triggered the MI6 to research about them. Some of this organization had emerged in and from UK, and you can find them on the company houses if you search them. Others represent third country brotherhood organization used in London as based for the overseas activities. What became clear, it was this: the Muslim Brotherhood generally tries to transform and remodel individuals and communities, all kind of communities, through what we call a bottom-up approach. All the academics are aware of this approach, and where possible to participate in politics, where possible. Remember that, where possible. If it's possible, they will do so. They would not avoid it whatsoever. But if needed, the Muslim Brotherhood, and this part literally I remember Cengiz, the great ambassador of Britain in Saudi Arabia. He literally quoted this in his review, saying, "If needed, the Muslim Brotherhood is willing to use violence and terror in support of their long-term goals, if needed." If needed. The Muslim Brotherhoods in the West uses doublespeak. Dr. Ashraf, I believe, yes, he spoke about this. The public narrative in the West in English, and the message is significantly different in the Arabic. Victor has been following on this for quite long now. I think he's aware of that. There's two different narratives when you read. It's like a different story, different books, different chapters. Much about the Muslim Brotherhoods in the UK remains secretive, very secretive, including the membership, fundraising, educational programs. But the Muslim Brotherhoods associate and work in Britain and have through time had significant influence on the largest Muslim student organization. They run it every year. And because they approved to the government of the United Kingdom that they have some connection with the communities, Muslim communities, based on that, they made a dialogue with the government of Britain, and they got some of the support and charities for their mosque. And believe it or not, in Britain you have 10 mosques that has the capacity of 4,000 people. Out of those 10 mosques, we have 6 of them belongs to the Muslim Brotherhoods. Now, we have 279 mosques that has the capacity of 200 people to 300 people. Out of them, we have 86 that belongs to the Muslim Brotherhood. And one of them in Birmingham is one of the biggest mosques in Amana. It's called the Amana Mosque in Small Heath, or in Small Heath area, which has more than 9 mosques. And so the aspects of Muslim Brotherhood ideology and the tactics they use in UK and overseas are conflicting with British values, with the European values, with the Middle Eastern values, and have been conflicting to the national interest and international security. But obviously, after all that report was put in through the parliament, by the way, during David Cameron time, nothing happened since then because of their lobby. They had their own lobby, as we spoke of. They had their own MPs, their charities, their companies, and because of the certain regime financing them, we're talking about the Qatari regime, for example, Qatari regime, when they sponsored the Muslim Brotherhoods, and with a 2.5 billion, we're talking about during Morsi time, and Qatari Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim bin Jabir Al Thani, who reportedly and secretly transferred their funds as high as 850 million. That's been reported by a lot of newspapers, and there's a lot of report about this in 2013. In Egypt, the group collected. And Egypt is really important. Well, we don't know about right now, but back then in 2011, and I'm sure Dr. Ashraf can confirm this, and all the academics here, they literally were collecting tax and fees from approximately 600,000 members. That's more than 500,000 from the people in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhoods own commercial enterprises such as supermarket, furniture stores, call it whichever. All this, they have their profit from. And if we do not, I'm just going to wrap up right now. If we do not stop the rain of money, as I explained it, and how is it coming, we cannot stop them. They will keep fade in and fade out through the society. They have their tactics where they fade in and fade out. Well, let me now end up with this Jewish quote that says in Hebrew, Lo mishekam tit kadim bet yot hai kashay nachaho astir, which means it does not matter how slowly you go, as long as you do not stop. And hopefully this train of understanding and countering Muslim Brotherhood does not stop. And whatever we do, and we should know, creating a bright, prosperous, and peaceful future cannot be achieved by responding or reproducing experience that have proven failure in the past. And I hope if we have any guy who speaks Hebrew, hopefully I pronounce the quote very well. I'm still learning. Well, thank you guys.
Great, thank you very much for this presentation and for this attempt to speak Hebrew. I don't know if someone can perhaps tell us how accurate it was. I can personally, but I'm sure we're all very pleased with the effort. Thank you so much for this. So great, very rich presentation with facts and analysis and for pointing out very useful reminder here. So thank you very much, sir, for this presentation. So moving to our fourth speaker for today. So Liam Duffy, who's an independent researcher, speaker, and trainer on terrorism and extremism with experience in both government and NGO counter-terrorism work. So Liam has spoken on 9/11 and the war on terror in New York City, on the impact of terrorism at the Imperial War Museum in London, and on youth radicalization in schools across the UK. And he has appeared in the Telegraph, in the Washington Post, and for the Times educational supplement on extremism. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us today, Liam, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen as well. And I'm also dealing with background noise from just about every direction right now. So hopefully everyone can deal with that, because I'm trying my best, including, I think there's an 8-year-old's flute lesson going on right above me. So I'll do my best. So, okay, someone give me a thumbs up if they can see that. Perfect, thank you everyone. So I was asked to speak about the Brotherhood's global trajectory and the threats and dangers. And I thought about the best way to do this really is to talk about the Brotherhood, but actually the kind of Western Islamist movement's relationship with Western governments, particularly in Western Europe and North America, and in terms particularly in their relationship when it comes to counterterrorism policy, because I think that really shapes the way that not just the Brotherhood, but the way their kind of ideological offspring have interacted with the state as well. And obviously what's been going on in France and Austria as well has just caused so much controversy controversy and attention in the last few weeks. I thought, looking at this from the perspective of France and some other Western European nations is probably a good place to start. So again, I won't go into too much history, but obviously I think we all know that, talking about back in the 60s and the 70s, the first kind of generation of Western brothers kind of settled in Europe and in North America, and they were obviously fleeing persecution in a lot of instances in their home countries. And I think when they arrived, obviously these are very intelligent, very educated, very politically active people, and they all, went about setting up NGOs and think tanks and charities. And I think in that early generation, a lot of the organizations were quite homeward looking. They were, planning about a kind of triumphant return back to the home countries, when the regimes they opposed were overthrown. But I think as time went on and people got accustomed to living in London or Paris or Brussels, that actually started to look at the Western European countries themselves and become more focused there. Some of them not only were thinking about their home countries, as was mentioned by Amjad just previously, some of them were actually looking, supporting some of the more belligerent offshoots were supporting Hamas as well. So that was obviously, we've had Charity Commission investigations in Britain and federal investigations in the United States into that sort of activity as well. So you have this graduation from an outward-looking kind of ideological orbit to a more, what can we actually do at home as well? And I think since then, in the last couple of decades, particularly, and maybe particularly since the Rushdie affair, we've had a kind of an orbit spring up, or an archipelago of groups across Europe, which don't maintain necessarily formal connections to any Islamist political parties in the Middle East or North Africa, but they are nonetheless influenced by them. And If anybody wants to go and check my Twitter, which I don't recommend to anybody, I got into an argument about this with somebody yesterday, and I said, it doesn't really matter what the leadership in Egypt has to say about Sayyid Qutb or violence when you have revivalist groups in London or Paris or Brussels who are influenced by Qutb themselves and don't renounce non-violence. So it doesn't really matter. They don't have that much command and control over this next generation of groups. So I think that's a really important point I want to make, that there is a landscape of groups that are influenced by the Brothers and by Jamaati Islami as well, but that are not actually formally connected. So they are part of this picture as well for Western European governments. So I think obviously after 9/11 and after Madrid and after the London bombings, we had what a lot of the MB groups and the Islamist groups did was positioning themselves as a kind of firewall against jihadism, and against, particularly after 7/7, against homegrown radicalization, jihadist radicalization. And in my own country, I can't speak too confidently about other countries, but in my own country, what this resulted in was Muslim Brotherhood offshoot groups actually receiving funding through preventing violent extremism initiatives in the early days. So when the early iterations of what's known as the UK's Prevent strategy were looking solely at counterterrorism, they were looking solely at the violence and not the ideological component. It was believed that the Islamist groups could represent a bulwark or a moderating influence in this respect. Fast forward to now, and I think it's really hard to ignore that Gumbel's failure, or many failures. But I think what was really instrumental in changing the attitude there was this. There's a screenshot of it on the page there. Is the 2009 Policy Exchange report, Choosing Our Friends Wisely, which really set out the criteria for engagement and funding of these groups. And if I can give you one of the kind of worst or most egregious examples, there was a Muslim Brotherhood group in East London that received funding from the local authority to hold a debate against Hizb ut-Tahrir activists. So you had a debate between Muslim Brotherhood and Hizb ut-Tahrir, and nobody really making the case for the kind of liberal democratic nation state. And this is supposed to be, operating as a firewall against extremism. The worst part about this is that the Hizb ut-Tahrir activists actually won the debate. So not only did it not moderate, the more extreme iteration actually ended up winning the debate, or the more militant or rejectionist when it comes to democracy won. So I think what we saw off the back of things like that report were a real change in the conversation, and that was most noticeable under Prime Minister David Cameron, who made his famous Munich Security Conference speech, where he was pretty clear about the role of the non-violent component. We say non-violent, obviously that's up for debate, but the non-violent Islamist ideology in the jihadist terror threat that various countries were facing. Obviously, I'm not going to read the quote out there that you can see on the screen, but we had the Muslim Brotherhood review, which has been mentioned by Amjad as well. We had integration reviews, which also touched on the role of Muslim Brotherhood groups as well. And we really had this learning exercise in what is the role of these groups in society, what's the impact. I would say, since David Cameron left office, that has really dropped down the radar a little bit, and we're seeing some of the same mistakes, I think, in the mid and early 2000s being made again, I would argue. Until what we've seen in France, I think France and Austria are really leading, I think, the conversation on this. So fast forwarding now, obviously, from 2009, 2011 to President Macron's term, and he's had this term separatism, Islamist separatism. And this is kind of doesn't really make much sense, I think, to native English speakers, because it's if you don't have this sense of the Republic and a constitution and Republican values, it can sound a bit clunky and strange to talk about separatism. But I think what he's really worried about is there's two elements. I think, as I mentioned right at the start, there's been this evolution of the Western Islamist movement, that isn't really under the command and control of any kind of formal party anywhere else in the world. And in France in particular, there's been a cross-pollination between the Islamist groups and the Salafi, the more activist political Salafi groups. So you've had this term emerge in French discourse called Frero-Salafist, which is supposed to kind of point to that combination of brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood, and Salafi thinking. And Macron's argument is this is forming a counter society. And I don't want to ascribe motive to anybody, but I honestly think, whether he's right or not, is another matter. But I think that Macron thinks that the French Republic will tear itself apart at the seams if he doesn't counter this at some point. Whether that happens in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years is another matter. I think he thinks that. I think he genuinely believes that. Again, whether he's right or not is a different issue. So that's the kind of cultural and societal and values and cohesion issue. But there's also the counterterrorism side of that as well. And there's been a huge shift in France and in other countries like Belgium as well, from over-individualizing. I would argue my own country, Britain, really over-individualizes the terrorism problem. I mean, I put that image of the person on the laptop and the mysterious kind of hacker very deliberately, because I'm sure everybody has seen newspaper headlines and BBC stories about radicalization, and how many times is it accompanied by an image like that? And I really reject this view that radicalization is happening because, you know, we have these shadowy online recruiters like reaching into children's bedrooms and kind of got this hypnotic power over them with propaganda. I just think that's a really terrible way of looking at this problem. And that, although that does happen, undoubtedly, that, you know, there is things like online radicalization where people are groomed. It fundamentally doesn't explain why, for instance, 5,000 or 6,000 Western Europeans joined ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So there's been a real shift in France from looking at the individuals to the environments, and some real leading scholarly work on this has played a role here. So scholars like Hugo Micheron, Bernard Rougier, and Gilles Capel have really taken this conversation in a new direction and looking at the role that these, what would be called separatist groups, are playing in radicalization. And I think the argument basically is that they've spread this ideology, which, while not preaching the same tactics as the jihadist groups, is preaching the same ideological endgame as the jihadist groups, but that the strategy is different. And I think there's all sorts of things about this hostility to French society and culture and values, which they think is really creating the fertile conditions for terrorist radicalization. So it's really gone in a new direction completely in France. And I wrote as much recently, while I think we can disagree with their prescription and their remedies in some instances, I think their diagnosis is correct. Their diagnosis of the problem is correct. And I think there were really early signs of this environmental issue with France's first kind of experiences with this modern jihadist wave, which was the Mohamed Marat attack in Toulouse and Montauban in southwest France. You know, this very kind of hostile to French foreign policy and French history. You know, even in the fact that he targeted French soldiers in his first element of his attack. But also you see the statement from the sister there that I've put on the screen, Suad Mara, is almost as enlightening as anything Mohammed said himself, because that shows you how much of this is an environmental problem. So Mohamed Marat has excuse me, this is really horrible. Mohamed Marat has shot an 8-year-old Jewish girl in the head at point blank range in a school in Toulouse. And his sister, instead of, you know, disowning her brother's actions, says, "I'm proud of my brother. You know, I detest Jews. I detest everybody who massacres Muslims." And she herself was kind of embedded in these kind of Islamist activist circles in Toulouse. So this environmental, this geographical, this worldview, this ideological ecosystem doesn't come from nowhere. Mohamed Marat doesn't come from nowhere. There's an ideological ecosystem around these people. So I think looking at it as lone wolves or online radicalization is, although it happens, I don't think it explains the whole phenomenon. So I think, although this was back in 2012, I think 8 years later, we're looking more at this element of the problem. And this is just a quick plug. I've just done a paper for the Counter-Extremism Project, the New York-based think tank, on the narratives of Islamist groups in the West. And I'm talking about Islamist groups all the way from the non-violent to the jihadist groups. And I won't go into this now, but I came up with 4 common narratives to Islamist groups and jihadist groups. The first, again, Amjad mentioned this, there's this idea that there's a war on Islam, a global war on Islam, the kind of need for an Islamic state or an Islamic caliphate. It kind of takes on this utopian dimensions, I think, with Islamist groups. And then a hostility or an enmity for Western, the West as a kind of intellectual, moral, religious construct. And then this idea that Western Muslim communities are constantly under attack and under siege. And I think the obvious question, if you believe in all these narratives, is, well, surely I should do something about it. So I think what I'm saying is that inadvertently, Islamist groups are introducing these 4 narratives, which are also shared by jihadist groups, into the mainstream in European society and Western societies. So anyway, so I think this will be out on the 10th of December. So again, if you want to follow me on Twitter or connect with me on LinkedIn, I'll definitely be doing some self-promotion on there. But if anybody is interested in it, but I think this is another key role of this holistic Islamist picture in the West, is these four elements. And a really key example of this recently is just we saw with Samuel Paty's gruesome murder in a kind of Paris suburb, talking about this idea that there's a war on Islam and there's Western Muslims are under siege. This preacher who allegedly had links to French Brotherhood figures and Hamas figures, he told his followers, if we tolerate these cartoons, we might get what happened tomorrow in Srebrenica, which is obviously the Serbian genocide of Bosnian Muslims. So there's this real idea that there's an existential threat facing Western Muslims, which is, to my mind, a really dangerous narrative to put into the mainstream. I'll skip over this because I'm probably taking too much time, but I think we know that Vienna is making many of the same moves against domestic Islamism as well. So what I'm saying is that there's been a kind of continental shift. There's been the counterterrorism element where people are looking at ideology and environments as much as the individual. Then there's this fear about the counterculture, these parallel values and parallel laws and societies popping up in European cities. And then there's a sovereignty issue as well. It's whose laws and whose values are we obeying? In the French case, is that the values of the Fifth Republic, or is that the values of, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood or these other Islamist groups? So there's a real sovereignty question here, and this is a totally new way of looking at this problem, I think. And how the brothers respond is going to be a real key part of that. And this is just to wrap up, which is what I was asked to do, was talk about the threats and dangers. And I think one thing that's been rolling around in my head is if there's a European crackdown on non-violent Islamism, will the non-violent Islamist groups, the Brotherhood groups, and those offspring, will they suddenly see themselves as facing an existential threat? If they do, does that line between violence and non-violence kind of evaporate? Does it become much thinner at least? And I think we've actually already seen this a little bit with Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is obviously a totally different group. But some of their content recently exploiting the situation in France and Charlie Hebdo has been almost indistinguishable from what Al-Qaeda might say. It's very much call to arms, a call to defend Islam from, French blasphemy and French effort. So I think that line between violence and non-violence, there's a risk with the more belligerent ecosystems that it kind of fades a little bit. I think the other risk is that the United Kingdom can become a weak link here. I think in Europe, there's a very different way of looking at this problem. And there's, tackling these Islamist groups is very different in terms of either funding or in terms of, whether they're actually even allowed to operate. And I just think the UK is way, way behind some of our European neighbours on this discussion. So I know London in particular has been a haven for radicals in the past. I'm just wondering if that's going to happen again, if there's a European shift. The other element we've seen is, in terms of France especially, is this really intense international pressure. And I think every Western government should be looking at this with real nervousness and trepidation, because France's efforts to counter its dreadful terrorist threat have gone beyond the usual platitudes and niceties. And the response they've got, from people like President Erdogan, from Imran Khan, have been, to an extent, expected, but they've also really succeeded in mobilizing a lot of international pressure. Part of this is a myriad of think tanks and NGOs that are the offspring of the brothers as well, who are obviously mobilizing in opposition to this. The other element, and I've written about this recently, has been the American press, which simply does not understand, understands what French universalism is, doesn't understand what laicity is, and it doesn't understand what Islamism is. And there's just been a real confusion in the American press over what President Macron actually wants to do. And part of this is a real curveball for me in 2020, and this is going to make tackling Islamism, non-violent Islamism, much harder, I think, for every Western government, is the emergence or the mainstreaming of kind of intersectionality and identity politics. because a lot of Islamist groups have adopted this language, this social justice language, this postmodern language, this identity politics language, and they're good at dressing their concerns in social justice language. And that does get a lot of supporters now on the liberal left and progressive side of the political spectrum. And I think we're seeing that in the response in America. So I think that's going to be a huge, huge challenge for any Western government that really wants to tackle this long term, is the amount of pressure and opposition they're going to receive. So I hope that, I have no idea how long I took, but I hope that wasn't too long. That was just a bit of an overview. That's my email if anyone wants to get in touch. But here's, I've written on various subjects to do with this very recently. 2 very recent articles on Islamism for Unheard, the British publication. So if anybody does want to check out more of my writing on this. And then I think in the bottom corner is the kind of a little bit over the top, but I did choose it, so I can't blame anyone, front cover for my upcoming report on the Islamist narratives in the West. So yeah, I hope that explains the kind of dynamic that's going on between the Brotherhood, but also the broader Islamist movement in the West and their relationship to states. Yeah, so that's me, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Liam, for some very insightful comments on the evolution of Islamist groups in the West and some of the key challenges facing European countries right now, in particular, and especially in how to deal with the non-violent Islamist groups. So thank you very much for this presentation. And luckily for all of us, we didn't hear too much flute in the background, so that was perfect. Thank you so much for this. So I'd like to introduce our 5th speaker for today, Dr. Ilan Berman. So he's the Senior Vice President for the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington. He's an expert on regional security in Middle East and Central Asia and the Russian Federation. And he has consulted for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, as well as U.S. Departments of State and Defense, and provided assistance to, on foreign policy and national security issues to a range of governmental agencies and congressional offices. He's the author of several books and edited books as well, including Iran's Deadly Ambition, the Islamic Republic's Quest for Global Power, published in 2015. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. Please, Doctor, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. This is, it's wonderful to be here. It's nice to see everybody virtually. I don't have flute. I have children virtually studying upstairs, so you may hear some screams. Please bear with me. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I did notice, sort of as I was preparing my remarks, that I'm the only American on this panel. And so I actually thought a little bit of comparative perspective on where US policy is. Oh, I'm sorry. But where US policy is, I'm in
American, so just to,
oh.
I'm American too.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, welcome. I have a maybe dubious distinction of actually living in Washington and sort of watching firsthand as this foreign policy transition is taking place right now in the city. So I actually think that the comparative advantage that I can provide here is to sort of to show how things are changing, how the sort of what the orienting principles were for the outgoing administration's approach to the Muslim Brotherhood and to the region broadly, and sort of what the assumptions are, what assumptions we're carrying as the incoming administration, as the Biden administration takes office, and sort of what we can expect to see. So let me start simply by talking about the sort of the changing nature of the Brotherhood as a movement, because I think it's very clear the Brotherhood is a movement in transition, and here it's useful, for all those of us who are students of organizational theory, to recognize that movements are living, breathing things, and the Muslim Brotherhood is no different. And so what we've seen over the last several years is a pretty significant shift in internal attitudes in the group, in terms of strategy, both locally and globally. Much of this is driven by the Brotherhood's political victory in the throes of the Arab Spring, both in Egypt and elsewhere. Just focusing on Egypt, though, for a minute, I think it's useful to understand that the Brotherhood's promises to not intervene in the opposition to Hosni Mubarak and the ultimate ouster of Hosni Mubarak and the political transition that happened after, the fact that the Brotherhood's promises were hollow ultimately, and the Brotherhood did intervene, was frankly entirely predictable. The group was the most organized and powerful voice in Egypt at the time. I would argue sort of one of the most powerful and most organized voices in the Arab Spring as a whole. And its activism, I think, was entirely predictable. And it was also logical. Look, historically, there are clear analogs to this sort of behavior, the sort of behavior we saw from the Brotherhood in the Arab Spring. In 1917, you saw the Bolsheviks harness the revolutionary currents of the Russian Revolution, the disaffection with the czars, to essentially shape that political movement to their desires. You saw exactly the same thing happen by Iran's clergy in the ferment of 1978, 1979, culminating in the Islamic Revolution of 1979. So I think what we see here is very clearly a consolidated political actor that was opportunistic and seized the opportunity. And the reversal of fortune that happened over the successive 2 years, I think, is really dramatic, and it needs to be understood. The 2013 ouster of Mohamed Morsi from the Egyptian presidency was an inflection point for the group. And what we've seen since then has been an internal fragmentation, a fairly significant internal fragmentation. And we can now envision what we in Washington call a number of alternative futures for the group. There's a struggle for the soul of the movement that's now underway. It's a contest between forces that you could call participationist and forces that you could call rejectionist. The youth wing of the Brotherhood is far more radical. The old guard is less so. That tension between those two factions was seen in the movement's revised charter when it was issued in Egypt in 2017, which echoed far more strongly the more radical sort of anti-establishment voice of the youth wing than it did the more measured pace of the old guard. I think that's significant because there is, in terms of the Brotherhood's orientation, the Brotherhood has always flourished comparatively by being participationist in nature, by essentially trying to work within existing systems to try to modify them, right, is the charitable view, subvert them is the uncharitable view, but obviously working within existing systems and remolding them in its own image. But what you now have within the organization is a not unsubstantial strain that talks about a rejection of the system as a whole. And this moves at least that faction of the Brotherhood much closer to the types of groups for which it has historically served as a gateway, far more radical, violent groups that reject the existing order and seek to overturn the table itself. And how this plays out will have enormous consequences, not only for the future of the Brotherhood itself, but also for all of the countries that have Brotherhood branches, both official and unofficial. So that's my first point. The second point, I think, is that it's necessary to understand that while it's useful to talk, I think makes for a useful device to talk about the Brotherhood as a unified international movement. I think the reality is that it's not quite the case. It's tempting to think of the Brotherhood as a unitary actor, but the reality is more complicated. There are an estimated 18 separate official branches of the group today, and there are many, many more unofficial movements, factions, groups that are ideological fellow travelers, groups that are sort of follow-on offshoots that are more radical that the group feeds into. While some of these are closely tied to the Egyptian branch, others are less so, and some of them are enormously significant in the national politics of their respective countries. We talked earlier about Morocco's PJD. I would also flag the Islamic Action Front in Jordan, which serves as that country's main Islamist opposition. All of this is, I think, very significant, and I highlight all of this as a precursor for that discussion that I mentioned about understanding U.S. policy. And here it's useful to, I think, talk about the fact that blacklisting the Brotherhood has been a topic of significant debate in American foreign policy for years, and especially so over the last 4 years under the Trump administration. There have been multiple congressional resolutions. There have been potential executive orders that have reportedly been drafted but not passed. None of them have been successful. And the reason they haven't been successful is because there's a recognition in Washington that there's an inherent danger in a ban that is too broad, because it would have an incidental effect of derailing U.S. diplomatic relations with a number of regional states, including countries like Tunisia, countries like Morocco. This is, I think, there's a layer of complexity that's added to this by two additional factors. The first is the ongoing Gulf state dispute with Qatar. In the United States, there was an early embrace by the Trump administration of the view that Qatar needed to alter its foreign policy, needed to become a more constructive foreign policy actor. Over time, though, that view has diminished, and there have been voices in the administration that have carried the day, and they have counseled the idea that Qatar needs to be rehabilitated for a host of reasons, for the stability of U.S. military basing in the region and other factors. But this has led to a more hands-off approach to Qatar on the part of the Trump administration than you'd have otherwise. And this includes also not really raising an issue about something that is, I think, very much of concern, which is Qatari support and sustenance for the Muslim Brotherhood itself. The second complicating factor, I think, is the Trump administration's guiding of the current normalization wave that's taking place in the Middle East. This is an effort that has encompassed enormous political capital in Washington. It's a tremendously hopeful effort, but it's also an effort that's still unfolding. And there has, for example, been a lot of need to sell the normalization wave, or sort of explain the normalization wave to audiences throughout the Arab world, including through outlets like Al Jazeera, which have historically served as mouthpieces for groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. And this has also, I think, conspired to create a more hands-off approach on the part of the Trump administration than you would have otherwise to the group writ large, and also to Qatar's role in providing it with sustenance. And so what you see come out of this is, the whole is less than the sum of its parts. There was a lot of expectation that the United States would adopt a more forceful strategy towards the Muslim Brotherhood, especially under the Trump administration. This hasn't happened. And what we haven't defaulted to a more nuanced approach yet either. What is needed, I think, is a more tailored and targeted measures that are intended to isolate the group in these respective countries. This approach, though, this sort of graduated approach, hasn't really materialized, however, and it's not, I would argue, it's not likely to now as we transition out of the Trump administration and into the Biden administration. The incoming administration is very likely, I think, to take a softer tack towards the group as a whole and not to press the advantage. And I use that term, I think, advisedly, because there is an advantage in various places, including in the Emirates, in places like Jordan. We're seeing greater efforts to isolate and limit the group's influence, and they're working. The Brotherhood is now very much on the defensive. A great example that I can provide to you of this is the electoral results from Jordan's election of just a few days ago, where the Islamist Action Front and Islamist groups generally had far less sway than most observers had expected that they would garner in terms of political representation. And so for the United States, as we enter this period of transition, as we enter a new administration that is busy formulating its own priorities with regard to the Middle East, we have to make sure that we don't do anything inadvertently that makes the group more powerful again. So let me conclude just with 2 points of promotion. Liam, I think, did exactly the right thing and pointed to his writings on the subject. I would point to a couple of things that my organization, the American Foreign Policy Council, has done that may prove useful to the other speakers, also to the viewership. The first is a project that we run called the World Almanac of Islamism. It's a multi-platform project. It's digital. It's also in print. It's online at almanac.afpc.org. And it is as close as we can make to a global view on the political phenomenon of Islamism and as it affects regions and the world over. Many case studies, including an excellent chapter on the Muslim Brotherhood and its evolution and its current global reach. The second is highlighting something that also that Liam talked about, the ideological question. I am thankfully in the final stages, and by final stages I mean that it's going to the publisher in the next couple of days, of a big book on precisely the issue that the Cameron government in the UK highlighted in its day, and that the French government is highlighting now, which is the ideological dimension. There is very much a struggle underway, a struggle for dominance among different ideological strains throughout the Muslim world. This isn't a struggle that the United States is an intrinsic part of, but we can certainly understand the struggle better and amplify certain voices. And so the book project that I'm finishing, which will be out early next year, is called Wars of Ideas, Theology and Interpretation in the Muslim World. And it looks in comparative perspective at the different soft power strategies that various countries, including the United Arab Emirates, are taking to try to counteract the ideology of Islamist groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood, through a whole of government effort. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for this presentation, and we do look forward to reading this this forthcoming publication, hopefully very soon. You said early next year, so we do look forward to it. I was told that Dr. Cesari unfortunately has to leave us a little bit earlier, so I just wanted to thank you for your time today. It's been a great pleasure to formally meet you, and thank you very much for your time and your presentation today. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. So moving on to our sixth speaker today. Last but certainly not least, it's a great pleasure to have with us today Dr. Eran Lerman, who's the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Dr. Lerman has served previously as Deputy Director for Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the National Security Council in the Israeli Prime Minister's office. He held also senior positions in the IDF military intelligence for over 20 years. And he's an expert, on Israel's foreign relations and on the Middle East. And he holds a PhD from the LSE, London School of Economics, and a mid-career MPA from Harvard University. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, sir. So please, the floor is yours.
Victor, shukran jazilan to you and to Trends for having me. Actually, in this particular forum, I would say that my claim to fame is that I wrote an essay on Maududi's concept of Islam, which was published when I was a little over 20, which was a while ago. But people still quote it from time to time, and I think I'm going to go back to the core of it. Listening to the discussion so far, it struck me that if there's anything I can bring in addition to all the wisdom we've already heard, is to try and bring some of the strings together or to use a title of a paper of mine 2 years ago, to forge this into a kind of weapon. And the weapon is a three-pronged, like Neptune's weapon, because we do need to keep the balance between three elements. All of them were present here, and all need to be part of a coherent strategy if we are to contend with the challenge of the Brotherhood. And of course, the more radical elements that circle around it. And I called it the three-pronged approach of strong security, social change, and ideological warfare. And I'm sorry, Dr. Cesare has left us, because she's made the point that we may face again a serious emphasis on the social dimension, both in Muslim majority countries and in Muslim communities which live a sort of semi-isolated social life within the West. So the social dimension is clearly an important part, which was, I would say, the predominant element in the Obama administration CVE concept, which we met when I was still in government. I have to say I've met Israelis who thought this was nonsense, and their instinct was to focus on the securitizing of the question. I would accept that a serious, consistent, coherent social effort to draw people away from the kind of infrastructure of dawah that has become so central to the work of the Brotherhood is an important part of the story. But clearly it needs to be constantly in balance and in intelligent interaction with the two other elements. Security, penetration, the capacity to tell the good guys from the bad guys. Well, what can I say? I wonder sometimes, how does it come about that there are more Australian volunteers with Daesh than Israeli Arabs? And the answer lies, among other things, in an intelligent securitization of the matter. And I'm not going to be shy about this. This is important, and it works. However, I'm going to spend a few more minutes, and we are running out of time, on the ideological battle, which I think I fully agree is vital to in terms of what lies ahead. I'm very glad to hear that Ilan's book will be coming out. I think that we are facing not only double speak, but a dual problem. The MB has been able to market itself in the West as essentially a movement that has gone through a democratization transition. And very influential pieces of literature that have come out in recent years, whether it's Worth or Fitzpatrick on Egypt into the hands of the soldier, have become essentially, I would say, vehicles for the MB argument. And we need to basically deconstruct the democratic pretense. And to the Arab world and to the Muslim communities, they come across nowadays as essential. And here there has been a trap of our own linguistic making as usuliyun, as if they represent the asl, the origins. This is a rough translation from fundamentalism, and I'm very glad that the French don't use that term. It is ubiquitous in the West, and it is misleading. But I believe that in the ideological battle, there is one way of dealing with both challenges, which is to go back to the origins and point out that the birth certificate of both Jamaat-e-Islam of Maududi and Hassan al-Banna's Brotherhood was in the age of totalitarianism and under the imprint of totalitarianism. If this was a racehorse, I would say, of Islam by modern Western revolutionary totalitarianism, whether you're looking at the Bolshevik template or the Nazi template coming in through various angles. To some extent, Maududi was trying to tell us that Muhammad was the first Lenin. And the Mufti was telling us that the Nazi template is where we should go. And in Hassan al-Banna and certainly in Qutb, you find the imprint of the totalitarian rejection of Western democracy and Western society. This is where we should go back to. These are movements born from the crisis of the West, the Spenglerian decline, a fantasy, the story about how totalitarianism will replace the liberal rot in the circumstances created specifically in Egypt in the 1930s, the crisis, the Sidki dictatorship, all of that, and the economic crisis. And then so we need to talk about history, and we need to talk about it in a way which deconstructs the Brotherhood's claim to be a democratic fundamentalist movement, fundamentalist to Muslims and democratic to Westerners. And I think it's doable, but it requires a coherent effort, and it is an effort that should be systemically linked to what governments are doing. And I think this is going to intensify. And I will not take much longer. I do want to make two more points. One is that there is a real debate as to whether the Egyptian or the Jordanian method is preferable in undermining the legitimacy of the Ikhwanji phenomenon. The Jordanians, I have to say, have done a pretty good job of bringing them into the system and then essentially weakening them to the point of irrelevance. That may be an interesting debate to engage in. Clearly, the martyrdom of Rabah al-Adawiya did not necessarily reduce the appeal of the Brotherhood to some people. But leaving them as a kind of a semi-ridiculous adjunct to Jordanian politics is a different story. Maybe, I'm just throwing a thought here, keeping Hamas as an impoverished adjunct and facing Israel, unable to do much about it, and taking Qatari money to keep quiet, is basically taking the Muslim Brotherhood jihadist fantasy and turning it into the mafia proposition it really is. So ironies abound here, but one more point needs to be made. There's an elephant in the room. It was mentioned in passing. Much will depend on how Erdogan's challenge to the stability of the Eastern Mediterranean and the region as a whole is handled. I think the emergence of a coherent alignment, I'm not saying alliance, but alignment, which is European and Eastern Mediterranean and Gulf at the same time. I mean, from France to the UAE with Greece and Cyprus, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Bahrain, Sudan, all of them in that mix, I think is going to be crucial in facing off the challenge that Erdogan poses, not only in terms of hard power, but also in terms of soft power and moral support for the Brotherhood as a proposition. And I think I'll stop there if we have, so we may have time for some quick exchanges in the very limited time we still have.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for this presentation and for these insightful remarks. So yes, we still have about 10-15 minutes for Q&A. And several questions have come to us. One, I mean, the first one is directed to Amjad, but I think it will be also interesting to hear perhaps Liam also on this one. It's about the, I mean, it's a question related to Muslim Brotherhoods in the West. And it asks, you know, about the current, I mean, the past crackdown on Muslim Brotherhood in the West, especially in France, and how, you know, this will impact the presence of the Muslim Brotherhood there and its relations with Western governments. So how basically the relations between Muslim Brotherhoods and Western government are likely to evolve in the next coming years. So perhaps, Amjad, we can start with you if you want to answer this.
Well, let me start with this figure first. Has the West got any problem with the Muslim people? No, they don't. I mean, the Muslim society is part of the West society, the Western society, and I'm trying to find the info. There you go. There we go. So, and to prove that, let's talk about France. And a lot of people, if you see recently, they start attacking France, and France is fighting Muslim people and all that. That's not true. 2002, 260 mosques are in France, and most of them are being sponsored by the government. And we're talking about more than 6 million people live in France in peace and prosperity for quite long. And we're talking about more than 4,000 French people become Muslim every year, according to the French stats. And but where is the problem then? Why does France, for example, right now, when France went and had a blind eyes of what's happening in France for quite long, or as Lim spoke about, Dofi spoke about how like Britain used one of the cases, for example, they wanted to counter terrorism or radicalization by using the Muslim Brotherhood, which didn't work very well. And we hope Biden is not going to use the same policy. Hopefully not. I don't expect them to do so, because I think Biden also understands the fact that Muslim Brotherhoods, they're almost like a burnt card right now. He's not going to use them anymore, or any of the Democrats, they're not going to use it. Not expecting them to do so. But where's the problem? The problem, for example, we give you an example here in France. There are, out of those 2,000 mosques, there are 600 mosques. With every single year, Erdogan's regime sends more than 120 clerics to teach those people in France about Islam and so on. And he doesn't teach them definitely about Islam. He teaches them about the radicalization of Islam. And as one of our colleagues mentioned, there's a big grown Salafi section in France. A very simple example of that. Can you imagine the Qaradawi's book, Yusuf al-Qaradawi's book, are being in France and in Islamic Society of Boston Culture Center in Roxbury, which is the same mosque that was attended by the two brothers who carried out the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. Guess what he says in that book? Yusuf al-Qaradawi books existed in those places in France and in Boston, on those mosques. And that literally Yusuf al-Qaradawi in January 13, 2009, speech aired out on Qatar state-owned Al Jazeera TV network said what? Throughout history, he literally said that, throughout history, God has imposed upon the Jews people who would punish them for their corruption. The last punishment was carried out by Hitler. Who is that? Al-Qaradawi. Where is his books? Are right there in the libraries of those mosques run by the Muslim Brotherhood in France and in Boston. That's the problem.
Thank you. Liam, would you like to add something?
Sure. Yeah, I'll be really quick. I think if European perceptions of the threat are changing, the Muslim Brotherhood will adapt. It's as simple as that. Its great strength over the years has been its flexibility and its pragmatism. There's been a lot of talk of doublespeak, and I think that's a key element to it. Is you might get Brotherhood factions going on like an LGBT walk one day, and then another day you will get them preaching against same-sex marriage behind closed doors and things like that. So they will adapt and they will find new allies, and who knows? We've seen tentative moves between the far right in France and Islamist parties as well. Could they find common bedfellows because of shared social conservatism on the right in Europe, rather than the progressive and anti-war, anti-imperialist left. In terms of the relationship with the state, I'm not sure there's a great relationship to begin with in France. At least in terms of, obviously, I'm sure there's intelligence exchanges and there's a relationship there between law enforcement. But in terms of social cohesion and high governmental level engagement, I'm not sure there's much of a relationship right now. I think, again, just to reiterate one of my final points is I think this will take a united European shift. Otherwise, you risk countries becoming a kind of, if an organization is dissolved in France and relocates to London and starts talking about but carries on all its activities about France, it renders France's approach completely useless. So that's an interesting one, is whether the rest of the continent will follow Macron's lead or not. At the moment, it seems like people are tentatively, moving into that space that he's carving out. So we'll see, but they will adapt.
Thank you. We have a second question directed to Dr. Ilan. So, Doctor, you mentioned that the Brotherhood is not a unified organization, but there's a question about its role in recent years. Most specifically, asking has the or whether the international organization of the Muslim Brotherhood has played any role in helping save the group after the heavy blows it has received in recent years? And if so, how? What role did it play there?
Right. No, I think that's a good question. And to be clear, just because, I sort of stand by the point that this is not a unified movement. So there's nothing that spans multiple continents is so unified that there isn't diversity of opinion. But that doesn't mean that there isn't communication. And that, I think, becomes very important. Dr. Lerman talked about, Hamas and the role, and Hamas is I think a very interesting test case of sort of this strategic distance that you have, even geographically, very close between the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Egyptian branch, and sort of the diversity of opinion. But that doesn't mean, I think, that what happens to, for lack of a better term, to the mothership doesn't affect the other branches. So that's why I made the point that I did about sort of this massive reversal of fortune that has taken place over the last 7 years or so in Egypt to the Muslim Brotherhood, and the reorientation that's happening in the group ideologically as a result. Because my sense is that the Egyptian branch is primus inter pares, right? It is first among equals. It is the one that everybody looks to for ideological inspiration. And I think what happens ideologically with the Egyptian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, whether it ultimately chooses to remain participationist or moves more fully into rejectionist mode, including an embrace of more violent, more direct action against the Egyptian state, is going to trickle down to subsidiary branches. Maybe not as direct orders, but certainly as sort of a reference point that different groups in various countries are looking to. And that's why I think the Brotherhood as a whole is worth watching, and the Egyptian branch is worth watching in particular.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We also have a question, well, related to U.S. foreign policy and how it might, the way the new American, the American president-elect Joe Biden is likely to to shape U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Muslim brotherhoods during his mandate. So, and more largely, the evolution the U.S. foreign policy may have vis-a-vis Muslim brotherhoods in coming years. And so we've heard the view from Dr. Ilan, the view from Washington from Dr. Ilan about this, and perhaps it will be interesting to have the view from the region about how the U.S. foreign policy may evolve in coming years. And so perhaps I could ask Dr. Ashraf to tell us what he thinks, or how a Biden administration may change the U.S. relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, or the way it may evolve in coming years. And perhaps, Dr. Iran, if you want to also tell us a little bit, I mean, your view on this, that will be very interesting. So perhaps we can start with Dr. Ashraf on this.
اعتقد السؤال اللي بيطرح نفسه فعلا ان جماعه الاخوان المسلمين كانت بتراهن على فوز جو بايدن في الانتخابات الرئاسيه الامريكيه، لكن السؤال هل فعلا الرئيس الامريكي المنتخب هيعيد سياسه احياء الرئيس اوباما الخاصه بجماعه الاخوان المسلمين وحركات الاسلام السياسي بوجه عام، بمعنى انه ممكن يتعامل مع جماعه الاخوان المسلمين في المستقبل والنظر اليها باعتبارها جماعه معتدله يمكن توظيفها في مواجهه التيارات الاسلام السياسي، او ممكن اللجوء اليها كبديل سياسي جاهز لبعض انظمه الحكم. اتصور يعني ان الزمن لا يعود الى الوراء، وان الرئيس المنتخب جو بايدن لن يعيد احياء سياسات الرئيس الامريكي السابق باراك اوباما، خاصه فيما يتعلق بجماعه الاخوان المسلمين، وخاصه ان هناك حقائق ومعطيات عديده ظهرت في العامين الماضيين، من بينها يعني داخل الولايات المتحده في تحذيرات داخل الكونجرس. اعتقد ان في لجنه الامن القومي في الكونجرس حذرت في عام 2018 من خطوره ايديولوجيه جماعه الاخوان المسلمين على المصالح الامريكيه، واعتقد ان ده هيكون محدد في تعامل الرئيس جو بايدن المحتمل مع جماعه الاخوان المسلمين. العامل الثاني اللي ممكن يكون عامل قيد على سياسه الرئيس المنتخب جو بايدن بالنسبه لجماعه الاخوان المسلمين هو الراي العام العربي. يعني في استطلاعات راي عديده يعني ظهرت من ضمنها البرلمان العربي، حتى مركز ترندز يعني عقد الشهرين الماضيين اكثر من استطلاع راي كان بيستطلع فيه راي فيه المجتمع العربي والمجتمع العالمي بالنسبه لجماعه الاخوان المسلمين. فكانت في هناك قناعه، او في اغلبيه المستطلع ارائهم كانوا بينظروا الى جماعه الاخوان المسلمين باعتبارها تهديد حقيقي. وبالتالي اعتقد ان اي الرئيس الامريكي المنتخب جو بايدن سياخذ في الاعتبار راي الشعوب العربيه، خلافا لما كان الوضع عام 2011 امام احداث الربيع العربي، حيث كانت تتطلع الشعوب العربيه انذاك الى التغيير. لكن اعتقد مزاج الشعوب العربيه الان هو رفض هذه الجماعات الاسلامويه التي توظف الدين ولا ترفع منه سوى شعارات جوفاء. العامل الاخر الذي ايضا سيحكم على سياسه الرئيس جو بايدن في الفتره المقبله هو اعتراف اداره الرئيس الامريكي باراك اوباما في كتابه الجديد الارض الموعوده بفشل سياسه الولايات المتحده في التعامل مع احداث الربيع العربي، وفشل نظرته او فشل تعامله في جماعه الاخوان المسلمين، لان جماعه الاخوان المسلمين كان يعني يفترض ان هي وفقا لاداره الرئيس الامريكي السابق باراك اوباما جماعه معتدله وبديل جاهز لتولي السلطه، لكن تجربتها في الحكم في مصر وموقفها في العديد من دول الربيع العربي اظهرت انها جماعه انتهازيه تتاجر بالدين، توظف الدين لخدمه مصالحها. وبالتالي اتصور ان الرئيس جو بايدن سينتهج سياسه مخالفه لسياسه الرئيس الامريكي السابق باراك اوباما، وسياخذ في الاعتبار ايضا التطورات الاخيره في المواقف الاوروبيه تجاه جماعات الاخوان المسلمين وحركات الاسلام السياسي، خاصه ان ايديولوجيا هذه الجماعه العابره الحدود باتت مكشوفه للجميع، وانها تمثل تهديدا لقيم التعايش في المجتمعات الغربيه والولايات المتحده. شكرا.
Thank you very much. Is it something that you share, Doctor?
Well, I'm trying also to be optimistic. I think that the people who are most identified with looking at the Brotherhood essentially as a friend, quote unquote, Brennan and Rhodes, have not found their place in the new firmament, and that's encouraging. I am a bit worried about attitudes towards Sisi. I'm not underestimating the problems that the Sisi style of governance generates, but there will be pressure from within the Democratic Party to take a harsher line on Egypt's harsh line. That's, I think, something to watch for. At the same time, we have to bear in mind, I want to be very blunt, it was mentioned here, I think Ilham mentioned it, that there were elements, pro-Qatari elements in the administration. There was certainly a very important pro-Turkish element that has just left government before the changeover. Leave names aside, but there was and Trump himself had this kind of bizarre relationship with a strong man in Ankara. This is not the case with Biden. And here, the Turkish question could become very central to the discussion, and with it also the brotherhood question in a relatively positive direction. So I want to share Dr. Ashraf's optimism in this respect.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, I think we could continue this discussion for several more hours, but unfortunately we have run out of time. So on behalf of the whole team here as Trends, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for taking the time to join us today and for sharing your thought, your expertise, your knowledge on this very important and timely topic. Thank you also to all our viewers around the world.
Inshallah, we'll be able to do it in body.
Hopefully,
when we get rid of this pest.
Very soon. So that's just an introduction, and then we can, do the real thing. Hopefully, in the next few months. And before we leave, and before we can meet in person, I'd just like to also briefly point out that Trends will be holding another e-symposium entitled Investment Under the Guise of Religion, the Brotherhood's Economic Empire, which is scheduled to take place on December 22nd. So in a little bit less than a month. And so we hope that you'll be able to join us at this occasion. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening or rest of the day. And we do look forward to seeing you very soon. So all the best and thank you.